Julia Mitchell pulled the trigger 4 times, ending the lives of Isabella, Jasmine, Amelia, and Bella in a single night of horror. While the world saw a ruthless killer, Stephen Mitchell still called the woman he loved not a monster. This is the story of how an entire family's perfect image crumbled into tragedy, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. The Mitchell family lived in a neighborhood where life felt calm, the streets lined with neat houses and familiar faces. To the outside world, Stephen and Julia Mitchell seemed to have everything figured out. Stephen worked long hours at a local factory, often pulling late shifts to keep the household secure and provide for the future. He had a reputation for being dependable and hardworking, admired by co-workers for his dedication. Julia, meanwhile, stayed home with their 4 daughters, pouring all her energy into raising them. Neighbors often saw her walking hand in hand with the girls on their way to school. Her warm smile, a sign of a mother who appeared to have everything under control. Their daughters were the heart of the home. Isabella, the oldest at 14, was responsible and protective, often stepping in to help Julia with her younger sisters. She carried herself with maturity, admired by classmates and teachers alike. Jasmine, 12, was athletic and outgoing, happiest when she was running across the yard or joining a basketball game in the driveway. Amelia, 9, had a quiet and thoughtful nature, preferring the company of books over loud games. Bella, the youngest at 6, brought a spark of energy wherever she went, her laughter echoing through the house as she played. Together, the sisters filled the Mitchell household with noise, excitement, and the feeling of a family that had everything they needed. Julia tried to maintain traditions, no matter how busy life became. Family dinners were her way of keeping everyone connected. Even if Stephen came home late, she kept the food warm so they could all sit together around the table, sharing stories and laughter. Their home was decorated with family, smiling faces on birthdays, summer vacations at the lake, holiday gatherings. To anyone who stepped inside, the Mitchell family looked happy and secure. Teachers praised the girls for their manners, and neighbors often commented on how lucky the family seemed. But appearances only told part of the story. Julia carried a weight no one else could see. With Stephen gone so often for work, most of the parenting fell on her shoulders. She managed the girls' school schedules, kept the house running, balanced bills, and made sure no detail was overlooked. Though she rarely spoke of it, the exhaustion showed in fleeting moments, dark circles under her eyes, a distant expression when she thought no one was watching. Still, she forced herself to smile, hiding her struggles behind the image of a devoted mother who had everything under control. Julia had once dreamed of being an artist, sketching for hours and imagining a future filled with creativity. But those dreams faded as life demanded more of her. Motherhood became her identity, and while she loved her children deeply, she felt her own sense of self disappearing. 2 outsiders. The Mitchell home was a model of stability and happiness. But inside, unspoken tensions and invisible struggles lingered, quietly building toward a moment no one could have imagined. Julia's struggles were not obvious to those around her, but they were constant and heavy. Each day blended into the next, preparing meals, folding laundry, helping with homework, driving to school, cleaning, and starting it all again. She gave everything to her children, but in the process, she had little left for herself. What started as ordinary tiredness grew into something far deeper, a sadness that clung to her no matter how hard she tried to shake it off. Stephen believed his role was to provide for the family. He worked tirelessly, often leaving before the girls were awake and returning when they were already in bed. In his mind, his sacrifice of time was proof of his love. But what he didn't see was that Julia carried nearly every burden at home. When he finally came back at night, he was drained, too exhausted to notice the way her smile no longer reached her eyes. Their conversations grew brief and practical, focused only on bills, errands, and schedules. The closeness they once shared as a couple seemed to slip away quietly, replaced by silence and routine. Finances weighed heavily on Julia's mind. Raising 4 children was expensive, and while the family managed to get by, there was never much room for error. School trips, medical expenses, sports fees, and endless groceries stretched their budget thin. Julia was the one keeping track, cutting corners, and worrying about what would happen if an emergency arose. Every overdue bill felt like a personal failure, even though she was doing everything she possibly could. Over time, depression crept into her life in ways no one else noticed. Julia no longer felt joy in the things that once brought her comfort. Her sketchbooks, once filled with drawings, sat untouched in the attic. Activities she used to enjoy, gardening, baking, or reading bedtime stories, started to feel like chores. She continued them for the sake of her children, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. At night, when the house was finally quiet, Julia often sat alone in the kitchen, staring into the dark and wrestling with thoughts she couldn't bring herself to share. There were brief attempts to reach out. She mentioned to a friend that she felt overwhelmed, but her concerns were brushed aside with comments about how all mothers get tired. Once, she told Stephen she felt exhausted in ways she couldn't explain, but he misinterpreted her words as physical tiredness and promised to help more on weekends, a promise he rarely had the energy to keep. With time, Julia stopped speaking about her struggles at all. It was easier to stay silent than to risk being dismissed. To the outside world, the Mitchells were thriving. Isabella excelled in school, Jasmine shone in sports, Amelia's teachers admired her intelligence, and Bella's laughter filled the home. Stephen continued to work, proud of what he provided. Julia kept routine steady, ensuring everything looked normal. Yet beneath that surface was a woman unraveling, suffocated by expectations and loneliness. Her silence masked a growing despair that no one in her family or her community could see coming. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Julia's behavior began to shift in ways that were subtle but alarming if anyone had taken a closer look. She was still present for her daughters, still keeping routines intact, but her energy seemed forced, her smiles stretched too thin. There were moments when she became uncharacteristically affectionate, hugging Isabella, Jasmine, Amelia, and Bella longer than usual, writing them small notes to leave in their school bags, and whispering words of love with a kind of urgency. At first, it seemed like a mother simply reminding her children how much she cared. In reality, it was a quiet farewell that no one recognized. Julia's internet searches revealed more of her inner turmoil. She read stories of mothers who had harmed their children, tragic cases that shocked the world. Some articles she read repeatedly, almost as though she was trying to understand what could drive someone to such extremes. She began looking up firearms, telling Stephen that she wanted a gun for home protection, citing safety concerns when he worked late shifts. He trusted her reasoning and didn't argue. To him, it was a logical step for a mother alone with 4 daughters in the house. To Julia, however, it was something else entirely. Her actions around the house grew more unusual. She became obsessive about cleaning and organizing, making sure her daughters' clothes were perfectly folded and their belongings carefully put away. She sorted through boxes in the attic, discarding old items and packing away keepsakes. Neighbors noticed her absence from social gatherings, and friends commented that she seemed distant when they saw her, but no one pressed too hard. Everyone assumed she was simply busy with her 4 children, too tired for anything beyond her household duties. Isabella, the oldest, sensed that something wasn't right. She noticed the long silences, the way her mother sometimes stared off into space as though lost in another world. Julia brushed off her daughter's questions, insisting she was only tired. Jasmine and Amelia were too young to see the change as anything more than their mother being quieter than usual. Bella, still a child, was oblivious to the storm, quietly growing inside her mother's mind. Stephen remained unaware. His focus was on his job, his long hours leaving him blind to the warning signs. He appreciated Julia's extra affection with the children, believing it was proof of how strong her bond was with them. He noticed she had grown quieter, but assumed it was just stress, something she would work through on her own. He never imagined that her exhaustion, her silence, and her sudden focus on organization were pieces of something far more dangerous. To the outside world, nothing seemed unusual enough to raise alarm. The Mitchell family carried on with their lives, going to school, attending church, and keeping up appearances. Yet beneath the surface, Julia was preparing for something unthinkable. Her gestures of love, her organization, and her insistence on having a weapon were not acts of ordinary motherhood, but signs of a mind slipping into a dangerous darkness. And while the community saw her as a devoted mother, no one realized how close she was to making a decision that would destroy the very family she had spent her life building. It was a cold winter evening when Julia's breaking point arrived. The Mitchell home was quiet. the kind of silence that usually marked the end of another long day. Isabella was in her room working on homework. Jasmine was sprawled on the couch with a basketball resting at her side. Amelia sat curled up with a book, and Bella was playing with her dolls on the floor. To anyone looking in, it was an ordinary night in a household filled with 4 children, each absorbed in their own small worlds. But Julia's mind was somewhere else entirely, clouded by thoughts she could no longer control. The gun she had purchased weeks earlier sat hidden in the bedroom closet. She had told herself countless times it was only for protection, but deep inside, she knew it had become something more. That evening, she retrieved it, her hands trembling as she held its weight. The sound of the children's laughter and conversation carried faintly through the walls, a reminder of what she was about to do. She moved slowly through the house, her emotions in chaos, a mixture of sorrow, fear, and resignation. It was not rage that drove her, but a distorted belief that ending her daughter's lives was an act of twisted mercy, a way to protect them from a future she could no longer face. Isabella was the first. Focused on her homework, she never expected her mother to walk into the room with the weapon raised. The shot broke the silence, echoing through the walls of the house. Julia's breath shook as she turned away, tears streaming down her face. She moved next to Jasmine, who looked up in confusion when her mother entered the room. The second shot rang out, and the house began to fill with a suffocating stillness. Amelia was found curled on a bed with her book still open, unaware until the final moment. The third shot followed, and Julia's sobs grew louder, echoing through the quiet halls. Finally, Julia walked into Bella's room. The youngest child looked up from her dolls, innocent and trusting. Julia hesitated longer here, her body trembling violently as she lifted the weapon again. The final gunshot ended the night's fragile silence, leaving only the sound of Julia's broken sobs filling the rooms of the house. When it was over, Julia stood frozen, staring at what she had done. The walls that once carried laughter now echoed only with the ringing of gunfire and her cries. She lowered herself to the floor, the gun slipping from her grasp as reality pressed in on her. Hours seemed to pass as she sat there, unable to move, her mind trapped between denial and acceptance. She did not flee the house, nor did she attempt to hide what she had done. Instead, she remained seated on the living room floor, surrounded by the silence of her shattered family. The Mitchell home, once a place of warmth and love, had become the scene of a horror no one in the community could have imagined. And while Julia wept in the aftermath, the world outside carried on unaware that, within those walls, the lives of 4 young girls had been stolen in a single night. Stephen pulled into the driveway later than usual that night, weary from another long shift at the factory. The house looked the same as it always did from the outside lights, glowing softly through the windows. The faint outline of toys scattered across the porch. He expected to walk into the usual scene of his daughters winding down for bed, Julia tidying the kitchen, and the comforting sounds of family life. Instead, as soon as he stepped inside, he felt something was wrong. The air was still, far too still for a house with 4 children. The silence pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. He called out for Julia, expecting her to answer from the kitchen or living room. There was no response. The faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air, though he did not recognize it at first. Dropping his bag by the door, he walked further inside, his footsteps echoing in a way that unsettled him. Then he saw her. Julia was sitting on the living room floor, her body slumped forward, the handgun resting limply in her hand. Her eyes were wide, tear-stained, unfocused. For a moment, Stephen froze, his mind scrambling to understand what he was looking at. Panic surged through him as he rushed toward her, but before he could speak, his eyes darted toward the hallway. Something inside him told him to check on the children. He moved quickly from room to room, his chest tightening with each step. Isabella was the first he found, lying motionless at a desk where she had been doing homework. His heart stopped as he took in the sight, his mind unable to process it. He staggered backward, his breathing rapid and shallow, before stumbling into Jasmine's room. The same horrifying scene met him there. By the time he reached Amelia and Bella, the truth crashed down with unbearable force. His daughters were gone. All 4 of them. Stephen let out a sound that was part scream, part sob, collapsing to his knees in the hallway. The weight of the discovery crushed him. Every memory of laughter, every image of his daughters alive and full of joy, collided with the horrifying reality of what he had just seen. He could barely move, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he fumbled for his phone. Dialing emergency services, he choked out words that hardly made sense, struggling to describe the nightmare inside his home. When he returned to the living room, Julia was still sitting where he had left her. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Her expression was blank, as if she were locked inside her own mind. The gun had slipped from her grip and lay on the carpet. Stephen looked at her with a mixture of rage, confusion, and heartbreak. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sank against the wall, his body trembling, his world collapsing around him. As the distant sound of sirens began to approach, Stephen sat in shock, staring at the woman he once loved and the remnants of the life they had built. The house that had been filled with laughter and warmth only hours earlier was now drenched in silence, transformed into a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Nothing in his life could have prepared him for the moment he realized that everything he held dear had been destroyed in a single night. The news spread through the neighborhood within hours, traveling faster than anyone could have imagined. By morning, the Mitchell home was surrounded by flashing lights, yellow tape, and stunned onlookers who could not comprehend what had happened behind those familiar walls. Friends, neighbors, teachers, and church members stood in disbelief, whispering the same question over and over. How could Julia, a woman who had seemed so devoted to a family, take the lives of her 4 daughters? The tragedy shook the entire community to its core, leaving people searching for answers that would never come. At the elementary school where Amelia and Bella were students, teachers wept openly in the hallways. Classrooms that once echoed with their voices felt empty and heavy with grief. Their desks were left untouched, small reminders of the lives that had been cut short. Isabella's high school friends created makeshift memorials near her locker, filling the space with photographs, notes, and flowers. Jasmine's basketball team left her jersey draped over a chair at practice, the number glowing under the harsh gym lights as her teammates struggled to process the loss. Everywhere the girls had touched, a void now lingered, impossible to fill. Neighbors gathered outside the Mitchell home, leaving flowers, candles, and stuffed animals along the sidewalk. At night, the glow of flickering candles lit up the street as people stood together in silence. Mourning children who had once run and laughed through the same yards. Some prayed quietly while others sobbed openly, unable to make sense of what Julia had done. Parents clutched their own children tighter, shaken by the reminder that tragedy could strike even in the safest of places. News crews arrived quickly, their cameras capturing the sorrow etched on every face. Reporters spoke about the family's seemingly perfect image, contrasting it with the brutal reality that had unfolded. Strangers from neighboring towns came to pay respects, drawn by the horror of the story and the unbearable sadness of 4 young lives lost. Yet beneath the grief, there was confusion and anger. People debated whether Julia had been secretly struggling with something no one saw, or whether she had simply committed an unforgivable act that defied all explanation. The church the family attended held a vigil where hundreds gathered to mourn together. The pastor spoke about the fragility of life and the importance of reaching out in times of struggle. The service was filled with sobs, prayers, and a haunting silence as the names of Isabella, Jasmine, Amelia, and Bella were read aloud. Their photographs, framed and surrounded by flowers, sat at the front of the church. The sight of 4 young faces together in memorial broke even the strongest hearts in the room. Through it all, Stephen remained a figure of quiet devastation. He stood among the mourners, his face pale and hollow, offering no words. People looked at him with pity, unsure of how he could endure such a loss while standing so close to the woman responsible. The community struggled not only with their grief, but also with their judgment. Torn between condemning Julia as a monster and searching for some explanation that could humanize her actions, the Mitchell tragedy became more than a family's nightmare. It became a scar on an entire community. One that would be remembered for years as the day innocence was stolen in the most unthinkable way. Julia was arrested the night of the tragedy, her hands trembling as officers led her out of the Mitchell home. She did not resist, nor did she try to explain herself. She seemed hollow, detached, as though the reality of what she had done had not fully settled in. The community's grief soon turned into outrage, and the courthouse became the center of attention as Julia was charged with 4 counts of murder. The case drew widespread media coverage, with reporters crowding outside each day to capture updates on what quickly became one of the most shocking trials the town had ever seen. Prosecutors painted Julia as cold and deliberate. They emphasized the fact that she had purchased the gun weeks earlier, portraying it as evidence of premeditation. They spoke of her actions in chilling detail, describing how each of her daughters had been shot in their own rooms, defenseless and unaware. To the prosecution, Julia was not a mother overcome by weakness, but a calculated killer who had stolen for innocent lives. Their words resonated with many in the community who could not bring themselves to see her as anything other than a monster. But then came Stephen, stepping into the courtroom with a presence that stunned everyone. Despite his unimaginable grief, he did not stand with the prosecution. Instead, he chose to defend Julia, not her actions, but her humanity. He told the court that Julia had been battling something invisible, an illness that none of them had seen. He described the years of exhaustion, the overwhelming weight of responsibility, and the silent suffering she had carried while trying to appear strong for their daughters. His voice broke as he admitted he had not recognized the signs, insisting that she was not evil but deeply unwell. Stephen's testimony shocked the community. Many expected him to denounce Julia, to demand the harshest punishment possible. Instead, he spoke of her as a woman he had loved, the mother who had once filled their home with warmth. He said he could never forgive the act, but he refused to let the world define her solely by the horror of that night. His words left the courtroom divided. Some saw his defense as an act of compassion, a refusal to let hatred consume him. Others believed it was a betrayal to his daughter's memory, an attempt to excuse the inexcusable. Julia herself remained silent through much of the trial. She sat with her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly together. At moments, she wept quietly, but she never attempted to justify what she had done. The defense attorneys echoed Stephen's stance, arguing that her actions were the result of untreated mental illness and emotional collapse. They called experts to testify about depression and psychological breakdowns, trying to shift the narrative from cruelty to tragedy. The trial lasted 4 weeks, each day filled with raw emotion. The jury listened, torn between the brutal reality of 4 lost children and the picture of a woman crushed under the weight of her own mind. In the end, the court had to deliver justice, but Stephen's words lingered with everyone who heard them. His refusal to condemn Julia outright became one of the most controversial and unforgettable aspects of the case, cementing the Mitchell tragedy not only as a story of unimaginable loss, but also as a haunting exploration of love, grief, and the human struggle to understand the unthinkable. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned with their verdict. Every eye was fixed on Julia, who sat motionless, her shoulders slumped, her face pale. The judge read the words that would seal her fate. Guilty on all 4 counts of murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps rippled through the room, though the outcome had been expected. For the families of those mourning, it was a moment of justice. For Stephen, it was another layer of grief, one that closed the door on the life he had once known forever. Julia did not react when the sentence was announced. She did not cry, did not plead. She seemed numb, as though she had already accepted her punishment long before the trial had ended. When she was led away in handcuffs, she turned her head once toward Stephen, her expression unreadable. That brief glance was the last connection they would ever share. A silent farewell between 2 people whose lives had been shattered beyond repair. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, capturing reactions from a community still torn apart. Some expressed relief that Julia would never walk free again, calling her a danger who deserved no sympathy. Others spoke of Stephen's unusual defense of his wife, still grappling with his insistence that she was not a monster. The debate continued long after the trial, fueling headlines and discussions across the country. Julia's name became synonymous with tragedy, her story retold in countless articles, broadcasts, and documentaries. Meanwhile, Stephen withdrew from public life. He avoided interviews, refusing to relive the trauma through the lens of others. Instead, he visited the cemetery where his daughters were buried, often sitting for hours in silence, speaking only to them. Friends described him as a man trapped between love and loss, unable to fully hate Julia despite the horror of her actions. His decision to humanize her during the trial left him isolated, misunderstood by many who felt he should have condemned her more harshly. Yet for Stephen, it was the only way to survive. He carried the belief that clinging to compassion, however painful, was better than surrendering to bitterness. The Mitchell home was eventually sold, though neighbors said it never felt the same. For years, people slowed as they passed by, haunted by the memory of what had happened within its walls. Memorials for Isabella, Jasmine, Amelia, and Bella faded with time, but the memory of their laughter lingered in the hearts of those who had known them. Teachers, classmates, and neighbors spoke of the girls often, determined to remember their lives rather than their deaths. Julia lived out her sentence in prison, largely in isolation. She received few visitors, and her days were marked by silence and routine. Some reports suggested she expressed remorse privately, but she never made a public statement. She became a ghost in her own lifetime, her story preserved not in her words, but in the scars she left behind. The legacy of the tragedy was not just the crime itself, but the questions it left unanswered. Why had Julia done it? Could anyone have stopped her? Was Stephen right to insist she was more than the act that defined her? These questions lingered long after the trial, turning the Mitchell case into a story people struggled to make sense of. For those who had lived through it, the answers never came. All that remained was the devastating truth. 4 daughters gone, a family destroyed, and a community forever marked by the night when love and loss collided in the most unthinkable way.